Tonight I want to build on what we talked about last time. And last time we talked about where is God when the innocent suffer. And tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about a related question, not quite the same, at least it takes me in a different direction. And it is that question of why do bad things happen to good people? And if I were to summarize that, a response to that in a few words, it would be the reason is that God is love. That's why bad things happen to good people. And what I mean by that is this, that love requires freedom. You can command obedience, you can make somebody do what you want, but that's not love. Love requires freedom, because genuine love has to be freely given, or it's not love, right? And so, in order for God to have a relationship with a creature that could love in return, God took the risk of creating a species with freedom. And we have freedom to say yes to God's love, and we have freedom to say no. And when we say yes to God's love, that's what God intends, and generally, good things happen. When we reject the love that God so freely gives, I believe that's when bad things happen. And sometimes it's to ourselves, sometimes it's others, sometimes it's not really clear to us. But I think of Jesus' lament over Jerusalem, when he stood outside the city walls and he looked at the city and he said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, stoning the prophets and killing those who are sent to you. How often I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not." And I think in those 4 words, "but you would not," lies so much of human tragedy. That Jesus likens himself to a hen who wants to gather us, but sometimes we say, no, we don't want to do what you want. We want to do it our way. We don't want to follow you. And so because of the risk God took in allowing for human freedom, bad things happen. Now, I think there are some who believe that there isn't really any freedom, that freedom really isn't a part of the human experience. And my image for that is that some people think of God as like a classical composer. So I've had the privilege of singing Handel's Messiah several times at least. And the amazing thing about the Messiah is Handel wrote it in 1741 in about 28 days, something like that. And so when I go to sing Handel's Messiah, and before the concert even starts, if you ask me, what note are you supposed to sing when you're doing the Hallelujah chorus, your measure 48, and it's the 3rd beat, I can look it up and I can tell you, before I sing a note, what I'm supposed to be singing. I think that's how some people imagine life with God, that God has everything all lined out, and we're just going from note to note to note to note. And I suppose in some way it's comforting to think that God has every detail of our life already planned out. The problem with that, as I see it, is that it makes God the author of evil. That if everything that happens in my life is from God and is God's will, then God gives leukemia to 2-year-olds. And that God takes 19-year-olds in auto accidents. And God gives 78-year-olds dementia. That God gives everything in our lives and that it's all his will. And as I read the Gospels and the New Testament, I don't see anything like that. I cannot think of a single instance in all the Gospels where Jesus ever afflicted anyone with disease or an accident or death. He didn't give leprosy to the 10 lepers. He cleansed them of their leprosy. He didn't make Bartimaeus blind. He opened his eyes. He didn't put Lazarus in the grave. He called Lazarus from the grave. And so if you're to say that everything that happens is controlled by God and is from God, then you run into that problem of, well, why then is God afflicting kids with cancer? And you're struggling to come up with some reason for why would God do that? And you get these kind of, what should you say, questionable rationales trying to explain why God would do something like that. And so, so I have never been an advocate of that kind of theology. To be sure, what you have to give up is this image of God as the classical composer who has everything lined out, everything in your life is simply prescribed by God beforehand, and you're just kind of doing one thing after another. There's really no freedom at all, not on our part or on God's. I don't find that very satisfying, you know. The other thing some people have done historically is to say, well, then there's two gods. And this was the Manichaeans back in the first century, that there's the good God and the bad God. And the good God gives us the good things, and the bad God is the source of the bad things. The problem with that is that in the Old Testament and New Testament, there's this consistent witness that they're not 2 gods or 10 gods or 20 gods. There's one God, right? And so you have the problem of multiple gods then. I think that what has happened is that we sometimes confuse living by faith with living by fate. And those are two very different things. I don't know if any of you had to read Oedipus Rex when you were in college, but it's the Greek tragedy by Sophocles where Oedipus is the main character, but his parents are the king and the queen, and when his mother's pregnant with Oedipus, his dad goes to the oracle to find out kind of what the future is, and the oracle tells Oedipus's father that he will die by the hand of his son. And so when Oedipus is born, he takes him out and is just going to expose him to the elements and let him die so he won't kill him. But he's found by a shepherd, and shepherd raises him. And so Oedipus doesn't know that he is actually the prince, and that he then eventually kills his father and marries his mother. And there was nothing he could do about that because that's what the gods had decreed. That was his fate. And there was no way he could avoid that. That's the Greek notion of tragedy. The gods decree what's going to happen, for good or ill, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that some of that has creeped into Christianity in the West, is this notion of it's kind of this fatalistic, whatever happens is God's will, and there's nothing you can do about it but submit. By the way, that's kind of also the Islamic understanding of God. Everything that happens is God's will. Your job is to submit, because that's what Islam means. The word means is submission. And so the pious person submits to whatever God wills, for good or for ill. Well, that's one kind of faith to have, but I don't think it's really a New Testament faith, and it certainly, to me, is not consistent with Jesus. That to live with Jesus is not to live by fate, but to live by faith. And I think a much better image for God is not the classical composer, but the jazz musician. And that love always is free to improvise. That's the wonderful thing about love. You see that when you read through the Gospels, how Jesus had this tremendous freedom to do whatever was best for the person in front of him. It infuriated the Pharisees because they had all these rules lined out. But if Jesus saw that something was best for the person, I'm going to heal on the Sabbath day, for example, he did it. Love is always free to improvise for the sake of whatever is best for the person in front of me. It's not locked in. It's not rigid. It is always seeking the best of the neighbor. And so that's what jazz musicians do. You know, they have a structure, right? Melody, key signature, tempo. But within that, there is this great freedom to improvise in response to the moment, to the other musicians, to what's happening in the crowd, how you're feeling yourself. And I think that's how God works. And my favorite story, and you've heard me tell this before, is a story about Wynton Marsalis at the nightclub, New York City, 2001. He's up there by himself with his trumpet, playing I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance. And he's bringing this piece that he's improvised just to the climax, and he's going to bring it home. And somebody's cell phone went off. And David Hadjdu, who is the critic for the New York Times, wrote in his notes, "Magic ruined." And Marsalis stood there for a minute in silence, and the offender got up and ran out in horror out of the club. And Marsalis played back the cell phone ditty, note for note. And then he started to improvise on it. And he stretched it out, and he turned it inside out and upside down, and he changed keys about 3 times. And then he moved seamlessly into exactly where he had stopped when the cell phone went off. And finished up I Don't Stand a Ghost of a Chance, and everybody just erupted in applause. I mean, it was just so amazing that he took this little cell phone tune that could have spoiled everything, and he wove it into his improvisation on this tune. And I think that's precisely what the Lord is up to in our lives as well. That even when we mess up, he can take that and use it for his loving purposes. That we see that again and again in the scriptures. I mean, the story of the prodigal son is a story of a son who just screwed up royally, and yet his father welcomed him back, restored him to the household, set him on the right path again. In ancient Israel, that's the story of the exile and the return from exile. That whole story of how ancient Israel would go chasing after foreign gods, and God would send a prophet to say, "Return to the Lord your God. God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love." And they'd come back for a time, and then they'd go chasing after these other gods again. God would send another prophet, and they would return for a while. And then ultimately, after about 3 centuries worth of that, the Lord said, "Okay, if you love those foreign gods so much, I'll let you have them in spades." And the Babylonians rolled into Jerusalem in 587 BC, leveled the city, and took the best and the brightest off to Babylon, where they were for 70 years. But even then, the Lord sent these prophets who said, "You're going to come home." And you have these beautiful passages in the second part of Isaiah that are just these gorgeous passages of return. You know, "Comfort, comfort ye my people," Isaiah 40, about returning to the Lord and returning back to Jerusalem. And there's some of those beautiful passages that we read in Advent, that you can always come back, you can always come home, you can always return. The Lord will never abandon us or reject us. We may reject him, I know, I did as a teenager. He did not reject me. And so there's that beauty of God's, even when we mess up, of God's welcome, God's return, God's improvising in love to take even those moments and those experiences and use it for his loving purposes. So when bad things happen to good people, I can't tell you exactly why this person suffers in this way, and we'll get to that next time. There's no simple calculus you can use to say, well, that's why this person has cancer, or this is why this person has dementia, or this is why this marriage broke up. You can't, there's no simple calculus like that I think. that I'm aware of, certainly. But I think we can say that the reason that there are bad things in the world and that they happen even to the best of people is we live in a world in which we humans are free to say no to God. And when we say no to God and to God's love, bad things happen. And it may not be directly, that's the thing, the consequences aren't evenly meted out. Sometimes if I do something bad, I suffer because of it. But sometimes when I sin and reject God's love, others suffer because of it too. And then you have those extreme cases where you have Hitler, for example, who I believe just gave himself over to the powers of evil, completely rejected God's love. And when someone in power does that, and we've seen this all too often, the terror and the awful things that happen. And I do not think God wants that. I don't think God wills it. I don't think God is somehow satisfied with any of that. I think it breaks God's heart. But I think God can take even the worst of those things and use them for his loving purposes. And so I think that's that we live in a world in which we are free creatures, and that is our great glory, to be a species that has that kind of freedom. But that is also sometimes our greatest tragedy, is what we do with that freedom. And so I think that it's the misuse of our freedom that often causes those terrible things to happen. So I'll leave it there, and we can have some time to discuss kind of your own thoughts about this, your own experiences with this. Where does this take you? Where are the moments where you've had to wrestle with this very question? What have you found comforting and satisfying, but also true and good, as we wrestle with one of those profound questions of human existence, is that sense of undeserved, innocent suffering, when people suffer when they don't deserve it and they really shouldn't have to.